After a mistake that nearly destroyed everything, a Navy SEAL left the battlefield and bought a limestone mountain in the cold northern wilderness. He wasn't running from war. He was facing the one mistake he had never forgiven himself for. The people in town looked at him with caution. A former soldier building a home inside stone, alongside a German shepherd too intelligent to be just a pet. Then the storm came. The only road out was buried, and the mountain began to breathe in a way that made everyone realize they had judged him too quickly. And in that moment, strength alone was not enough. Instinct, faith, and preparation were truly put to the test. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and share your thoughts so this channel can keep growing stronger. And now, let's begin the story. The sky over northern Montana had a clean, bright cruelty to it, blue so pale it looked scraped thin, as if winter had tried to sand the color out of the world and hadn't quite finished. Pines stood shoulder to shoulder like old soldiers who had forgotten how to relax. Snow lay in sheets across the hills, broken only by the dark seams of rock and the dull silver of a creek that refused to freeze all the way. A pickup truck crawled along the last stretch of county road, tires hissing over packed powder. Inside, Griffin Hale drove with both hands on the wheel, not because the road demanded it, but because some habits were welded into bone. 35 years old, about 6 feet tall, lean and built like a tool meant to be used daily rather than displayed. He had the quiet, yet sufficient strength of someone who'd learned early that being heavy wasn't the same as being strong. His face was clean-shaven down to the discipline of the razor. Without stubble to soften it, his jaw looked squared by decision, cheekbones sharp enough to catch the winter light. His skin was fair, but weathered wind-burnished in the way the North did to anyone who spent time outside long enough to be noticed by it. His eyes, gray-green and steady, had the calm of a man who had already watched the world do its worst tricks and had survived the applause afterward. In the passenger footwell, a German shepherd lifted its head when the truck slowed for a bend. Sable 6 years old, sable coat shading from cream to gray to black like smoke over ash, watched the trees with amber eyes that missed almost nothing. The dog wore a black harness, edged with a deep, muted red that looked warmer against the cold, the way a coal looked warm even before it caught fire. One ear cocked, then the other, as if listening to a conversation the forest was trying not to have. Griffin glanced down and exhaled through his nose. "Yeah," he muttered, voice low, almost amused. "I see it too." Sable did not wag. It didn't need to. The dog's stillness was its language measured, precise, like a hand signal in a place where speaking could get you killed. Kettle Ridge appeared around the bend without ceremony. A small town tucked into the edge of the timberline, it looked like it had been built out of stubbornness and left there as a dare. A diner, a hardware store, a gas station with one flickering sign, and homes that sat hunched against the cold, as if they were trying to make themselves smaller targets. Griffin didn't come for charm. He came for distance. He parked near the sheriff's office, a squat building that looked more practical than proud, and stepped out into air that tasted like iron and clean wood. His boots crunched over gravel glazed with ice. The tactical combat shirt he wore, olive gray, if faded and softened by too many washes, hung comfortably on his frame. The cuffs and shoulders were worn thin in places, as if the fabric had carried more than its share of weight. Under it, a dark red thermal layer peaked at the collar and wrists, a small ember of color against winter's strict palette. His combat pants were old, too earth brown, with a hint of moss green, knees scuffed, cargo pockets sagging slightly from habit, as if they remembered carrying tools even when empty. A beat-up military watch sat on his wrist, scratched face catching a sliver of light. Sable hopped down after him, paws landing softly, then sat at Griffin's heel with an obedient patience that still felt like a choice. The door opened before Griffin reached it. Sheriff Marla Kincaid stepped out and met him like she'd been expecting trouble, and was mildly disappointed to find paperwork instead. She was in her late 40s, broad-shouldered, and carried herself with the straight-backed authority of someone who had learned the hard way that hesitation invited chaos. Her hair, dark with streaks of gray, was pulled into a low, practical knot. Her face held the kind of lines that came from squinting into weather and watching people lie. Her eyes, a cool brown, took in Griffin's posture, his hands, his dog, and the careful calm on his face. "You're Hale," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Griffin kept it respectful without bending too far. He'd learned the difference between politeness and submission. Marla's gaze dropped to Sable. "And that's Sable." Sable looked at her once brief, assessing, then returned its attention to the street like it had better things to do than charm local law enforcement. Marla's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Dogs got manners." "Better than mine," Griffin said, and for half a second the air between them warmed with something like humor. Not a second figure appeared in the doorway behind her. Deputy Colin Reyes, mid-20s, lean, with a fresh face that hadn't yet been fully introduced to the town's tragedies. His uniform looked newer than Marla's, his boots less scuffed. Dark hair cropped short, a faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, and a cautious skepticism in his eyes, like a man who'd read enough stories to suspect Griffin might be one. Colin's gaze snagged on the dog first, then the tactical clothing, then Griffin's eyes. "Sir," Colin said, not unfriendly, but careful. "You the one buying land up by the Limestone slope?" Griffin nodded once. "That's me." Marla shifted her weight. "We can talk inside." Warmer. Inside smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times, and paper that had lived in drawers. Griffin filled out the last of the forms, permits, property boundaries, and safety acknowledgments, because he hadn't come to the north to start a fight with bureaucracy. He'd fought enough things that bled. He could handle ink. Marla signed where she needed to, then leaned back in her chair. "Your plan," she said, tapping the paperwork, "is to renovate that old cut in the hillside." "It's an abandoned storage tunnel. Old mining days. I'm not digging deeper," Griffin replied. "I'm reinforcing what's there. Drainage, ventilation, a proper exit. All within code." Colin's eyebrow rose. "Most folks build cabins." Griffin's eyes didn't flinch. "Most folks like paying to heat the sky." That earned him a short, involuntary laugh from Colin. More surprise than amusement, like the deputy hadn't expected Griffin to have a sense of humor. Marla didn't laugh, but her tone softened by a hair. "People will talk." "They always do," Griffin said. He left the sheriff's office with papers in hand, and the strange relief of having something official to hold. Outside, the sun had shifted, the light sharper now. As Griffin walked toward his truck, a woman crossed the street toward him, careful steps on the slick pavement. June Calder looked like someone who belonged outdoors even when she was forced into town. Early 30s, tall and wiry, with wind-reddened cheeks, and hair the color of chestnut bark, braided down her back beneath a knit cap. Her eyes were bright hazel, curious, and when she spoke, It carried the steady confidence of someone used to explaining complicated things to people who didn't know they cared. "You're the new guy," she said, not accusatory, observational. "Depends who's asking." June smiled. June Calder. "I teach earth science at the school. I heard you bought the Limestone slope." Griffin paused. "That news travels fast." "This town doesn't have much entertainment," she said. "We make do." Sable leaned forward slightly, sniffing the air around June, not aggressive, just thorough. June didn't reach out to pet the dog like tourists did. She held still, letting the animal decide the terms. "I'm not here to scare you off," June added. "I'm here to tell you the rock up there is complicated." Griffin studied her. "Complicated how?" June tilted her head toward the tree line. "Karst limestone. Pockets, voids. It can be stable for decades and then shift when water finds a new path. If you're reinforcing an existing tunnel, do it right. Drainage matters. Venting matters. And..." She hesitated, then shrugged. "The ground remembers." Griffin felt that phrase land somewhere old inside him. "I plan to do it right," he said. June nodded once, as if satisfied. Then her gaze dropped to the worn fabric at Griffin's shoulder. "You were military." "Was. People here don't always know what to do with that," she said, voice gentle, not pitying. "They'll either make you a hero or a threat. Neither is fair." Griffin's mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Fair isn't really the North's hobby." June laughed at that light, quick, and waved as she stepped away, leaving behind the faint scent of pine and cold air. Griffin drove out of town and up toward his land. The road narrowed into a dirt track. Snow thickened. The world grew quieter, as if the trees absorbed sound like cloth absorbed water. When he finally stopped, the limestone slope rose ahead of him, pale rock banded with darker streaks, its face rough and patient. The entrance to the old tunnel sat half-hidden beneath a ledge, rimmed with moss and pale lichen. Someone long ago had framed it with stone. Griffin had already planned to add a steel door, a simple overhang to prevent snow buildup, and reflective markers for storms. Practical things. Human things. Sable jumped down and approached the opening, then stopped. The dog's body went rigid, not in fear, but in focus. Ears forward, tail still, nose lifted slightly as if tasting the air. Griffin's hand drifted to the strap of Sable's harness. "What is it?" he whispered. Art Sable didn't look back. It stared into the shadowed mouth of the tunnel, like it could see through stone. Griffin's chest tightened in a way he hated, because it felt too familiar. Somewhere far away in memory, a different dog had done something similar, gone still, signaled wrongness, and Griffin had waved it off because the radio said the building was clear, because the intel said the route was safe, because he'd been in a hurry to finish the job. He'd learned what it cost to ignore an animal that had no reason to lie. A small gust of wind moved down the tunnel and breathed cold air into Griffin's face. It carried dampness, mineral sharp, and something else faint, metallic, like old tools or old blood, though Griffin refused to give that thought a home. He forced himself to breathe evenly. "Okay," he said softly, like speaking to both the dog and the part of himself that wanted to flinch. "We'll check it." Griffin pulled out a flashlight and swept the beam across the entrance. The light caught rough stone, a shallow bend, and the glimmer of water deeper in. Nothing jumped out. No fresh tracks, no movement. But Sable remained still. Rehook, mid-chapter moment. As Griffin stepped closer, the dog finally moved. one slow pace forward, then abruptly turned its head toward the trees behind them. Not toward the town, not toward the road, toward the dense, dark line where the forest began. Sable gave a single, low huff. Not a bark, not a growl, a warning too subtle for anyone who didn't know the dog's language. Griffin followed the dog's gaze. Between two pines, half buried in snow, something pale caught the light for just a second, like a small shard of glass or reflective tape. Then the wind pushed a veil of powder across it, and it vanished. Griffin stood perfectly still, hearing only the quiet drip from somewhere inside the limestone. He felt the old, but instinctive itch at the base of his skull, the sense that the world had just blinked and dared him to pretend he hadn't noticed. Sable looked up at him once, amber eyes steady. Not afraid, not angry. Not just asking the same question it always asked in the only way it could. "Are you going to listen this time?" Griffin swallowed. His humor tried to surface and failed, like a match in wet wind. "All right," he murmured, and the words sounded like a promise. "We listen." He didn't go chasing ghosts into the trees. Not yet. He marked the spot mentally, the way you marked a suspicious door in a hallway. He turned his attention back to the tunnel entrance, because whatever lay ahead, home, trouble, or both, this was where he had chosen to plant his life. He spent the next hour unloading gear-basic tools, tarps, a stove, storage bins, working with the calm rhythm of someone who found peace in tasks with clear steps. Sable paced the perimeter, circling, sniffing, pausing at the tree line again and again, as if keeping time with something under the snow. By late afternoon, the sun lowered and the cold sharpened. Griffin set up a temporary camp just outside the entrance, not inside yet. He made coffee that tasted like survival more than comfort. When Sable finally lay down near his boots, the dog did not fully relax. One ear stayed up. That night, when the sky turned black and the stars burned hard and bright, Griffin heard footsteps crunching up the slope. He stood, hand near his flashlight, posture quiet but ready. Sable rose without a sound. An old man came into view carrying a lantern. Curtis Bellamy looked carved from winter. Late 70s, tall but stooped, beard white and bristled, skin weathered into a map of creases. His eyes were pale and sharp, the kind that had spent a lifetime watching rock and learning when it lied. He wore a heavy coat patched at the elbows and gloves stained with work. He stopped a few feet away and looked from Griffin to Sable. Then he nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "You're the one fixing the old cut," Curtis said. His voice was gravel warmed by fire. Griffin kept his tone respectful. "Yes, sir." Curtis lifted the lantern, light wobbling over the limestone entrance. "Folks in town will tell you that tunnel's nothing but an old storage hole," he said. "That's what they say when they don't want to remember." Griffin didn't interrupt. He'd learned that men like Curtis spoke in layers. Curtis's gaze settled on Sable. "That dog of yours," he said, "looks like it knows the difference between quiet and safe." Sable stared back, still as a statue. Curtis lowered the lantern slightly and looked Griffin in the eye. "Listen to me," he said. "Limestone is polite. It holds its tongue until it doesn't. The ground up here has pockets, voids, places water can disappear into and come back wrong. You can build a home in it. You can. But you don't get to treat it like a dead thing." Griffin felt the truth of that like weight. But Curtis took one slow breath, then delivered the warning that would brand itself into Griffin's memory. "Son," he said, "the rock doesn't care who you used to be. It only cares whether you listen. Because limestone never stays completely still. Curtis turned and began the slow walk back down the slope, lantern light bobbing like a tired star. Griffin watched until the glow disappeared into the trees. Then he looked at Sable, and in the dog's amber eyes he saw something that felt uncomfortably like fate patient, watchful, and not easily impressed. The night held its breath, and Griffin, for the first time in a long time, chose to hold his two just long enough to hear what the earth might say next. Morning arrived without drama, just a slow whitening of the ridge as light sifted through pine needles and touched the limestone face in pale bands. Frost clung to the rock like a second skin. Griffin Hale stood outside the tunnel entrance with a mug of coffee cooling between his hands, studying the slope the way he used to study a map before stepping into unknown ground. Sable sat beside him, sable coat catching the sun in layered shades, cream at the throat, gray along the ribs, black saddle dark against winter glare. The red-edged black harness lay snug over muscle and fur. The dog's posture was composed, but not relaxed. One ear pivoted lazily, tracking the faint movements of morning ice cracking along the creek, a raven's wing beat, distant timber popping as it adjusted to temperature. Griffin didn't speak. His silence was not emptiness to him. It was information waiting to be noticed. He set the mug down and crouched near the entrance. The limestone felt colder than the air, damp along the edges where condensation gathered. He traced the rock's texture with his gloved fingers, fine-grained in some sections, porous in others. Karst. June had been right. June Calder arrived shortly after sunrise, boots crunching up the slope with brisk purpose. She carried a weathered canvas field bag slung across her shoulder and a collapsible walking staff in one hand. Her braid swung against the back of her forest green jacket. She moved with the confident gait of someone accustomed to uneven ground, neither hesitant nor careless. "You're up early," she said, breath fogging faintly. "So are you." June smiled slightly. "Rock doesn't mind waiting. People do." She knelt near the entrance and brushed frost from the limestone wall. From her bag, she removed a small geology hammer and a hand lens and a folded topographic map laminated against weather. Her fingers were nimble and deliberate, nails short, hands wind-roughened from years outdoors. "This formation," she said, tapping lightly against the stone, "has microfractures. Nothing catastrophic by itself, but when snow melts unevenly, water slips into the smallest seams. It freezes again overnight, expands, contracts. It doesn't take much." Griffin listened, eyes tracking the slope above them. "You think it's unstable?" he asked. "I think it's patient," she replied. "That's worse." Sable rose and circled once, nose low. The dog moved along the base of the slope, pausing at certain points as if mapping scent into memory. Griffin had learned that Sable did not waste motion. Every pause meant something catalogued. June stood and stepped back to view the entrance from a distance. "You reinforcing the ceiling?" "Steel ribs, discreet. Anchor bolts drilled into stable bands only. I'll run drainage trenches here and here." He gestured with a gloved hand. "Water won't sit." June nodded, approving the precision in his explanation. "Most people don't plan that far." "I'm not most people." That earned him a sideways glance. Not judgmental, just observant. "No," she said softly. "You're not." Griffin turned toward the interior and flicked on his flashlight. The beam cut a steady line down the shallow bend. Inside, the air held a mineral chill, the faint scent of wet stone and something older dust from decades of quiet. He stepped carefully inside, boots crunching against grit. Sable followed, shoulder brushing his thigh before moving ahead by a controlled few feet. The tunnel widened into a small chamber where old wooden supports still stood. Griffin studied them closely, weathered but intact. "I'll replace those," he muttered. "No point trusting dead wood." June remained at the threshold, letting her eyes adjust. "Look, you don't strike me as someone looking for isolation," she said after a moment. "I'm not. Then what are you looking for?" Griffin paused. There were answers he could give that sounded simple. Privacy, efficiency, independence. But the truer one lived deeper. "Control," he said finally. "Over something." June didn't press further. She seemed to understand the weight beneath the word. They worked through the morning marking sections of rock, identifying drainage paths, noting areas of minor erosion. Griffin moved methodically, as if muscle memory guided him through more than just construction. Every measurement was double-checked. Every line drawn was deliberate. By midday, the sun had shifted high enough to soften the frost. Meltwater began to drip faintly from the overhang above the entrance. It formed a slow rhythm tap, tap, tap into the snow below. Sable stiffened. Griffin noticed before June did. The dog's head lifted sharply, the eyes narrowing toward the tree line above the slope. "What?" Griffin asked quietly. Sable didn't bark. It stepped forward 3 paces and stood between Griffin and the forest, body angled protectively without tension. June turned, following the dog's focus. The trees looked ordinary pine trunks dark against the light, branches heavy with snow. Then Griffin heard it. Not a snap. Not a footstep. A sound subtler, a hollow shift underfoot, as if something deep within the earth had exhaled. It lasted less than a second. Griffin's heartbeat climbed reflexively. June frowned. "Did you feel that?" He nodded once. "It's minor," she said quickly, perhaps reassuring herself as much as him. "Freeze-thaw adjustment. Happens all the time." But Sable did not relax. Without warning, Sable moved uphill several yards, nose pressed close to the snowpack. The dog began pawing gently, not frantic, not aggressive, just deliberate scraping. Griffin followed. At first he saw nothing but snow crust, then a glint. He knelt and brushed away powder with his glove. A strip of bright reflective tape lay partially embedded beneath the surface faded, torn at one edge. It didn't belong to nature. June inhaled sharply. "That's trail marker tape." "Old?" Griffin asked. "Could be years. Could be months." Her voice tightened slightly. "There used to be informal hiking routes up here before the school closed access. Nothing official." Griffin turned the tape over in his hand. It was brittle from cold, weathered but not ancient. Sable watched him, eyes steady, as if confirming. "You see it now." Griffin scanned the tree line again, slower this time. The slope above held subtle depressions beneath snow hard to distinguish from natural drift, but not impossible. "We're not chasing anything today," he said evenly, mostly to himself. "We're building." June exhaled. Good. But something had shifted, while Griffin tucked the tape into his pocket without comment. He would not let curiosity outrun caution. He had learned what happened when momentum overruled patience. They resumed work. Griffin measured anchor points for reinforcement beams. He marked the interior wall for ventilation channels. He traced where drainage trenches would guide meltwater away from the entrance. Sable returned to his side, but remained more alert than before, eyes flicking occasionally toward the trees. By late afternoon, a truck engine echoed up the ridge. Deputy Colin Reyes climbed out, jacket collar turned up against wind. He looked younger in daylight, sunlight revealing faint freckles across his nose, and the restless energy of someone who hadn't yet decided whether the world was predictable or not. "Sheriff sent me to check on the site," Colin said, climbing toward them carefully. "Make sure nothing's collapsing." "Nothing yet?" Griffin replied. Colin eyed the tunnel opening. You sure about this?" "I wouldn't start it if I wasn't." Colin nodded slowly, gaze lingering on Sable. "Dog seems on edge." "Dog's observant," Griffin corrected. Colin crouched near the entrance, brushing snow from his pant leg. "You know," he said hesitantly, "there was a minor sinkhole north of town 15 years back. Nobody hurt. But folks remember." Griffin appreciated the information. "That slope?" "Different formation, but similar limestone." June stepped forward. "This ridge is stable enough with reinforcement, as long as drainage is done right." Colin looked between them, uncertain but reassured by their confidence. "I'll log that you're following recommendations," he said finally. "Town doesn't need rumors." Griffin gave a small nod. Colin lingered a second longer than necessary, eyes scanning the forest. "Feels quiet up here." "It is," Griffin said. Colin gave a short laugh. "Yeah, guess I'm used to sirens?" He left shortly after, engine noise fading down the road. The ridge returned to stillness. By evening, Griffin had installed temporary supports inside the chamber and mapped where permanent reinforcements would go. The work felt grounding. Each bolt tightened was a small defiance against uncertainty. As dusk lowered, shadows stretched long across the snow. Griffin stood outside the entrance once more, Sable seated beside him. The forest exhaled cold air that smelled faintly of sap and distant water. He reached down and scratched behind Sable's ear. "You did good," he murmured. The dog leaned subtly into his hand. The reflective tape weighed lightly in his pocket, not heavy enough to alarm, but enough to remind. Griffin looked at the limestone slope, at the faint hairline fractures he now knew existed beneath the surface. He thought of Curtis's words about rock being polite, until it wasn't. Control, he reminded himself, did not mean dominance. It meant preparation. As darkness settled, Griffin carried his gear inside the entrance chamber, as positioning lantern light to cast warm gold against the stone. The interior felt different now, not empty, not yet home, but claimed. Sable lay at the threshold, facing outward toward the trees, guarding, listening. Griffin sat on a crate and watched the steady drip of meltwater outside. The ridge did not speak again that night, but it breathed, and this time Griffin was paying attention. The morning the call came, the air tasted different, not colder, not warmer, just unsettled. Griffin Hale noticed it before his phone vibrated against the crate inside the limestone chamber. Sable noticed it before that. The dog had been awake since dawn, pacing the entrance in tight, silent loops. Not anxious, not restless, just waiting for something to align. Griffin was tightening the final temporary brace inside the chamber when his phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number with a local prefix. He answered on the second ring. "Hale." Sheriff Marla Kincaid's voice came steady but clipped. "We've got a missing hunter. Name's Walter Hensley, 62. Went up toward the North Ridge yesterday afternoon. Didn't come back." Griffin's jaw tightened slightly. "Weather?" "Clear yesterday. Dropped below freezing overnight." A pause. "He knows the woods, or thinks he does." Translation. Pride involved. Marla continued. "Search teams assembling at the trailhead in 30. You said your dog's trained." "She is." Another beat of silence. Griffin imagined Marla weighing pride against practicality. "Bring her," she said, "and yourself." The call ended. Griffin exhaled once and crouched in front of Sable. The dog's amber eyes met his, calm, alert. "Work," he said quietly. The word shifted something in the air between them. Sable straightened, muscles aligning under her sable coat. 6 years old, past the impulsive stage of youth, not yet slowed by age, she carried the quiet confidence of experience. The black saddle along her back darkened toward her tail, while cream and gray feathered around her chest and flanks. Her ears stood sharp, triangular silhouettes against the cave's golden lantern light. Griffin clipped a long lead to her harness, but left it slack. Trust, not tension. The trailhead north of town sat at the edge of denser timber, where snow lay uneven, crusted in some places, soft in others. Several trucks were already parked when Griffin arrived. Deputy Colin Reyes stood near the hood of his cruiser, breath fogging in the cold. He looked less casual today, jaw set tighter, eyes scanning constantly. Nervous energy had replaced skepticism. Near him stood Walter Hensley's wife, Margaret. Margaret Hensley was small and compact, bundled in a heavy blue coat that made her appear almost swallowed by fabric. Her gray hair was cut short and practical, her face lined deeply but not weakly. The lines came from decades of squinting into sun and wind, not from softness. Her hands were clenched together in front of her chest, as if holding something invisible that she refused to drop. She looked at Griffin, and then at Sable. "That dog find people?" she asked, voice thin but steady. "Yes, ma'am," Griffin replied. Margaret nodded once, accepting that answer as if it were a contract. And Sheriff Marla stood a few paces away, briefing a small Team 3 volunteers from town. Among them was Evan Rourke, tall and broad-shouldered, beard thick and copper-red, face usually quick with sarcasm. Today he looked stripped of humor. Snow dusted his flannel jacket. His eyes avoided Margaret's. Marla turned when Griffin approached. "Last confirmed sighting was near the narrow cut by the old ridge bend," she said. "No fresh snowfall overnight. Tracks should still hold." Griffin crouched and let Sable scent a glove belonging to Walter, provided by Margaret with trembling fingers. Sable inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring once, then again. Her body shifted. Focus sharpened. "She'll take us," Griffin said. They moved in a loose formation up the ridge trail. Snow crunched under boots in uneven rhythm. The air smelled of pine sap and distant water beneath ice. Sable moved slightly ahead, nose low but not dragging. She paused at intersections without instruction, turning once, dismissing a wrong direction before committing to another. Griffin allowed her space to decide. Colin stayed near Griffin's left side. "You've done this before," the deputy said quietly. "Yes." "Combat?" Griffin didn't answer immediately. The forest held too much memory for easy replies. "Yes," he said at last. Colin nodded, as if that confirmed something he'd suspected but hadn't wanted to ask. They reached the ridge bend, a narrow shelf, where the trail curved sharply above a shallow drop. Snow here was churned in places. Sable halted abruptly, her head lifted, ears forward. She pivoted slightly downhill. Griffin felt the shift before understanding it. "Hold," he murmured to the group. Sable moved 10 feet down the slope, then veered left, circling in a tight arc. She stopped, sniffed the snowpack carefully, then stepped away and continued another few yards. Evan frowned. "Is she off track?" Griffin watched the dog's body language, not just movement, but tension along the spine, the rhythm of her breathing. "No," he said quietly. "She's sorting." Sorting. distinguishing overlapping scents. Snow trapped smells differently than dry earth. It muted, distorted. Sable paused again, then angled sharply toward a cluster of young firs. Griffin followed. At the base of one tree, snow was compressed. "Slide," Colin muttered. Not a dramatic one, just a small slip where someone had lost footing and scrambled. Sable continued downhill. The slope steepened gradually. Griffin signaled the others to move carefully. Ice crusted beneath powder in places, treacherous if rushed. 20 yards below the ridge, Sable stopped. Completely. Not searching. Not circling. Still. Griffin's pulse ticked upward. He stepped beside her. Below them, partly obscured by fallen branches, a figure lay twisted against the base of a tree. Walter Hensley. He was alive. Barely. Walter was broad-built even in age, with a thick gray beard frosted by condensation and a hunting jacket that had seen years of service. His face was weathered and sunburned permanently across the nose. Now it was pale beneath the frost. His rifle lay several feet away. He stirred faintly when Griffin knelt beside him. "Sir," Griffin said calmly. "Stay still." Walter's eyes fluttered open blue, stubborn even in confusion. "Damn slope," he rasped. Hypothermia was creeping in, but not yet dominant. One leg lay at an unnatural angle. "Fracture," Griffin assessed quietly. Colin slid down carefully beside him, radio already in hand. "We've got him." Sable stood just behind Griffin, watching Walter intently. No barking, no unnecessary movement, just presence. As Griffin secured a splint using improvised supports from the pack, Walter's gaze shifted weakly to the dog. "Did she find me?" he murmured. "Yes," Griffin said. Walter gave the faintest smile. "Good dog." As they prepared to lift Walter onto a stretcher improvised from poles and canvas, yet Sable suddenly turned her head sharply, not toward town, not uphill, but further down the slope into denser trees. Her body stiffened. Griffin felt it instantly. "Easy," he whispered. The others froze. There was no movement visible. No sound but wind brushing branches. Sable took 3 careful steps forward, then stopped. Nose lifted, testing air. For a long second, long enough to feel like a held breath, she stood there. Then slowly, deliberately, she returned to Griffin's side and sat. Griffin studied her. Not alarm. Confirmation. Something else had been there. Recently. But not now. He didn't voice it. Not yet. "Let's move," he said evenly. They carried Walter carefully up the slope, rotating positions to prevent slips. Griffin kept one hand lightly on Sable's harness the entire ascent. Not restraining, just connected. At the trailhead, Margaret rushed forward despite Marla's attempt to hold her back. She knelt beside Walter, brushing snow from his beard with shaking fingers. Tears came, silent and quick. Walter squeezed her hand weakly. "Told you I'd be fine," he muttered. Margaret shot him a look sharp enough to cut pride in half. "You'll live long enough to regret that," she said, voice thick. Even Evan barked out a short laugh of relief. As the ambulance prepared to depart, Marla stepped beside Griffin. "Good call," she said quietly. Griffin shook his head once. "Good dog." Marla glanced at Sable, who sat calmly amid chaos, tail resting against snow. "She doesn't seem like a miracle," Marla observed. "She's not," Griffin replied. "She's trained, and she listens." Marla's eyes flicked briefly to his face. "You do too?" Griffin didn't answer immediately. He watched the ambulance pull away, tires carving fresh tracks into snow. "Trying to," he said finally. As the crowd dispersed, Colin approached once more. "You think she picked up something else?" the deputy asked under his breath. John Griffin met his gaze steadily. "I think the woods remember everyone who walks through them," he said. "Some scents fade slower than others." Colin absorbed that, unsettled but thoughtful. By late afternoon, the ridge returned to quiet. Griffin and Sable walked back toward the limestone slope alone. The snow bore the marks of their search footprints crossing and recrossing, but already wind began softening edges. At the entrance to the tunnel, Sable paused and looked once more toward the distant timber. Griffin rested a hand briefly on her head. "You did your job," he said softly. Inside, the chamber weighted stone cool, air steady. Instinct was not magic. It was repetition. Attention. Trust built slowly and tested often. Griffin set his pack down and sat on the crate near the entrance. Outside, meltwater dripped again in slow rhythm. The ridge did not speak, but it had not been silent either, and Griffin, for the first time since leaving the service, felt something unfamiliar but steady settling into place. Not control, not certainty, just alignment. He had listened, and someone had come home because of it. The morning after Walter Hensley was carried down the ridge, the sky was the wrong kind of beautiful. It stretched overhead in a wide, forgiving blue, sunlight spilling generously across the snowfields as if the mountain had decided to perform innocence. Pine needles glittered. The creek ran louder than usual, thin ice cracking at its edges. It would have been easy, dangerously easy to believe the ridge had settled back into quiet. Griffin Hale didn't trust beauty that arrived too cleanly. He stood outside the limestone entrance, breath steady, hands tucked beneath his arms against the chill. The tactical shirt he wore, faded olive gray, bore faint mineral streaks from yesterday's work. The dark red thermal beneath it caught in the light when he moved. His combat pants were damp at the knees from repeated kneeling, in boots crusted with frozen mud. Sable stood a few yards upslope, watching the tree line. The dog had been different since the search. Not anxious, not restless, but attentive in a deeper way, like a compass adjusting to a magnetic field no one else could sense. Her amber eyes tracked meltwater sliding down bark, tracked the subtle creaks of timber adjusting to temperature shifts. Griffin crouched near the trench he had begun carving to redirect runoff away from the tunnel mouth. Overnight, the snowpack had softened slightly. It yielded more easily under his shovel than it had 2 days before. June Calder had warned him. Freeze. Thaw. Repeat. He glanced toward the ridge above the entrance. The limestone face appeared stable at a glance, solid, pale, streaked with darker veins. But he knew now what to look for. Hairline cracks like faint pencil marks beneath the surface. A truck engine echoed faintly from the road below. Sheriff Marla Kincaid climbed the slope carefully, boots deliberate. She had left her hat off today, dark hair pinned tight, the streaks of gray visible against sunlight. Her face looked less guarded than usual, but more thoughtful. "Heard Walter's surgery went well," she said without preamble. "Good," Griffin replied. Marla surveyed the trench. "June stopped by my office this morning." Griffin leaned on the shovel. "About the ridge?" "She's concerned." Marla's gaze shifted to the snowpack clinging to the upper ledges. "We're supposed to get a warming swing tomorrow afternoon, just a few hours above freezing, then back down overnight." Griffin nodded slowly. "That's not unusual," Marla added. "No," he said, "but it's enough." Marla studied him carefully. "You're not sounding alarmist." "I'm not," She folded her arms against the cold. But you're not relaxed either. Griffin met her eyes calmly. Relaxed isn't the goal. Marla's mouth twitched slightly. Before she could respond, Sable stiffened. Not dramatically. Subtly. Her ears angled toward the ridge above them. Her body shifted weight forward. Not defensive. Evaluating. Marla noticed. She hears something? She hears everything, Griffin said quietly. They both looked up. Nothing visible. Just sunlight melting the edges of cornices clinging to rock. A drop of water fell from a ledge above and struck the limestone with a hollow tap. Then another. Then a third. The rhythm quickened almost imperceptibly. June's voice echoed faintly from below the slope. She approached briskly, braid bouncing against her back, cheeks flushed from the climb. She carried a small weather meter clipped to her jacket. Temperature's already climbed 2 degrees since sunrise, she said, slightly out of breath. Faster than forecast. Griffin straightened. That's early, he said. Yes. June scanned the slope. It's not the air temperature alone that matters. It's the surface melt. She stepped closer to the rock face and placed her palm against it, closing her eyes briefly as if listening through skin. The limestone holds cold longer than soil, she murmured. But once the meltwater finds seams... She didn't finish the sentence. Sable moved again slow, controlled steps, positioning herself not at the entrance, but slightly to Griffin's right. He noticed immediately. She was triangulating, listening not just to what was in front of them, but above. A faint cracking sound reached them. Not sharp. More like a low internal shift. Marla inhaled slowly. That's not comforting. Griffin didn't answer. His eyes scanned upward along the ridgeline. A small section of snow detached from an upper ledge and slid downward in a soft rush, breaking apart before reaching them. Minor. Insignificant. Except it wasn't the snow that concerned him. It was what lay beneath it. Without warning, Sable stepped directly between Griffin and the tunnel entrance and pressed her shoulder lightly against his leg. Not pulling him away, not pushing forward, just anchoring. Griffin felt the contact like a current. He followed her line of sight. For a brief, almost imperceptible second, the limestone face above the entrance seemed to ripple, not visibly shifting, but darkening in a narrow line where meltwater traced a new path along a fracture that had not been wet the day before. June saw it, too. Her breath caught. That's new, she whispered. The dark line widened slightly as water seeped through. Not a collapse, not a slide, just a warning written in liquid. Griffin's mind moved quickly. Calculating angles, runoff direction, load weight of snowpack above. We redirect more water, he said calmly. Now. Marla nodded immediately. What do you need? Volunteers? Shovels? We widen the trench, divert flow before freeze tonight. Marla pulled her radio without hesitation. Within half an hour, 3 townspeople arrived, Evan Rourke among them, beard glinting copper in the sun. His sleeves rolled despite cold. His usual sarcasm had softened into practicality after the search rescue. You think it's sliding? Evan asked bluntly. Not yet, Griffin replied. We're making sure it doesn't. Evan didn't argue. They worked in coordinated rhythm, carving deeper channels along the slope's base to guide meltwater away from the entrance. June directed placement with precise gestures, calculating natural drainage patterns. Deputy Cullen arrived later with additional sandbags from town storage. He looked more serious today, less boyish. Sheriff said we're preventing future paperwork, he muttered as he hauled a bag into position. Griffin almost smiled. By mid-afternoon, the warmth peaked. Snow along the ridge above visibly sagged. Water trickled steadily down the limestone face. The dark fracture line remained thin but present. Sable maintained her post, eyes scanning constantly. Griffin felt something inside him aligning, not fear, but readiness. The kind that hummed beneath skin without shaking it. Control was an illusion. Preparation was not. As the sun dipped lower, temperatures began their gradual fall. The trickle slowed. Water in the trenches flowed cleanly away from the entrance, redirected into safer channels along the slope. The dark fracture line stopped widening. June crouched near it once more as the air cooled. "It's holding," she said quietly. "For now," Griffin replied. Marla stood beside him, hands on her hips, watching the ridge with thoughtful silence. "You're not panicking," she observed. "Panic wastes oxygen," he said. Marla exhaled faintly through her nose, a sign of approval. By dusk, the volunteers dispersed. Evan clapped Griffin once on the shoulder before heading down the slope. "Guess that rock picked the wrong week," Evan said gruffly. Griffin didn't answer. He knew rock didn't pick weeks. It responded. Sable finally relaxed slightly as cold reclaimed the slope. Her tail rested against the snow. Her ears still pivoted, but slower. Griffin stepped inside the tunnel entrance and lit the lantern. Warm light washed over the interior walls, revealing the temporary braces he had installed. He ran his hand along one steel support. Solid. Outside, the final meltwater droplets froze into thin icicles along the ledge. Griffin returned to the entrance and looked up one more time. The ridge stood quiet again. But it had spoken. Not loudly, not violently. Just enough to be heard by those willing to listen. He crouched beside Sable and rested his forehead briefly against the top of her head. "You felt it before we saw it," he murmured. Sable blinked slowly. Calm. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. The lesson wasn't about heroics. It was about timing. Above them, the snow settled into evening stillness. The ridge did not move again that night, and Griffin understood something clearly now. The mountain wasn't an enemy. It was a system. And systems could be read, if you paid attention long enough. The storm did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived like a quiet correction. By late afternoon, the sky had dulled from bright blue to a heavy white gray, the kind that flattened distance and made the ridge look closer than it was. Snow began again, not violent, not theatrical, just steady, deliberate flakes that layered over the slope Griffin had spent days reinforcing. Inside the limestone chamber, lantern light cast warm amber across steel supports and clean drainage lines. Griffin stood near the entrance, listening to the subtle change in wind direction. Sable was already there before he moved. The German shepherd sat at the threshold, body angled outward. Her sable coat caught stray light in layered shadow. The red-trimmed harness was visible beneath drifting snowflakes that clung briefly to her fur before melting from body heat, and her ears flicked twice. Griffin stepped outside. The wind had shifted north. Snow fell thicker now. He scanned the ridge above, no visible movement, no widening fractures. The trenches were channeling water effectively. But this storm was different. The air carried weight. His phone vibrated. Sheriff Marla Kincaid did not waste time. "We've got a problem," she said. "What kind?" "The only road south is blocked. Minor slide from the eastern shoulder. Not huge, but enough to shut it down." Griffin's jaw tightened. "Injuries?" "Not yet, but snow's picking up." "How bad?" "Enough." He ended the call and crouched beside Sable. "We move." The drive into town took longer than usual. Snow gathered along the road in uneven ridges. By the time Griffin reached Kettle Ridge's main street, plows were already struggling to keep pace. At the edge of town, where the road curved past the gas station and narrowed into the single route out. Once the problem was visible, a section of hillside had sloughed downward, a combination of wet snow and loosened soil. Not catastrophic, not a mountain collapsing, but heavy enough to pile across the asphalt in a thick, uneven barrier. Sheriff Marla stood near a cruiser, collar turned up against the wind. Deputy Colin Reyes worked with 2 town volunteers to direct vehicles back toward town center. Snow accumulated quickly over the fresh slide, masking its edges. Evan Rourke was there too, sleeves rolled despite falling snow, shovel already in hand. His copper beard was dusted white, his usual rough humor replaced by quiet focus. "How long?" Griffin asked as he approached. Marla glanced at him. "County cruiser 3 hours out minimum. Visibility's dropping." "Anyone stranded past it?" "Couple of drivers turned around in time. No one stuck on the far side." She exhaled slowly. "But if it builds..." Griffin studied the slope above the slide. The soil was dark, saturated from previous melt, and snow continued layering over it, adding weight. "This isn't about digging through," he said. "It's about preventing more." Marla nodded once. "We've got maybe 40 people in town total. If power goes..." Griffin didn't let her finish. "We consolidate," he said. "Get people off the road. Keep engines running only if necessary." Sable moved at his side, nose working the air. The wind howled briefly down the road, carrying the sharp scent of disturbed earth. Evan approached, shovel over his shoulder. "You think it'll go again?" he asked bluntly. "Maybe," Griffin answered honestly. "Depends on how much more the slope gives." Evan nodded once and didn't argue. They organized, quickly redirecting traffic toward Town Square, moving elderly residents closer to buildings with backup generators. The diner owner, Mrs. Talbot, a round-faced woman in her late 50s, with flour-dusted hands and a temperament that could scold grown men into silence, opened her doors without hesitation. "Hot coffee," she declared. "No arguments." Snow thickened. By early evening, power flickered once, then twice, then held. Inside the diner, townspeople clustered near windows. Voices were low, controlled. Fear was not loud here. It moved quietly between people, settling in shoulders and jawlines. Griffin stood near the entrance, boots leaving wet tracks on the tile floor. His tactical shirt was damp from snow, darkened along the shoulders. The red thermal beneath it glowed faintly when the overhead lights flickered. Sable lay near his boots, head upright. Then she rose. Slowly, her ears pivoted toward the road outside. Griffin followed her gaze. Through the frosted glass, he saw headlights approaching too fast for conditions. A pickup truck barreled down the road, brake lights flashing too late. "Move," Griffin said sharply. The truck hit the edge of the slide barrier and skidded sideways, slamming into a snowbank with a dull, heavy thud. Inside the diner, a collective gasp rippled. Griffin was already outside. Snow stung his face as wind intensified. He reached the driver's side door just as Sable circled the vehicle. The driver, a young man, early 20s, sat stunned behind the wheel. Dark hair plastered to his forehead, jaw clenched tight in shock. He looked more angry than afraid. "You hurt?" Griffin demanded. The man blinked, breathing hard. "No, I thought I could make it." "You can't," Griffin replied evenly. The young man pushed open the door and stepped into snow up to his shins. His name, Griffin would later learn, was Tyler Brooks. Tall but underfed, shoulders hunched forward as if bracing against criticism he expected. His father had run the local mill before it closed years ago, a closure that had hardened him into restless impatience. Tyler kicked the snowbank in frustration. "This town shuts down over nothing." Griffin met his gaze without raising his voice. It's not nothing," he said. Tyler's anger faltered slightly under the calm weight of Griffin's tone. Behind them, another low sound carried from the slope above the blocked road. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeper this time. Sable froze. Her body went rigid, head angled uphill. For a fraction of a second, everything felt suspended, the snow, the wind, even breath. Then a secondary shift occurred. A fresh wave of heavy, wet snow slumped downward from higher on the shoulder, spilling across the already blocked road in a thicker mass. Not a roaring avalanche, just gravity asserting itself, but enough to bury the front bumper of Tyler's truck deeper. Tyler stared at it, stunned. Griffin's voice cut through the moment. "Back inside, now!" They moved quickly, Griffin guiding Tyler by the elbow. Sable trotted at their side, eyes still scanning the slope. Inside the diner, Mrs. Talbot handed Tyler a mug before he could protest. "Sit," she ordered. He obeyed. Outside, snow continued steadily. The blocked road was now impassable without heavy machinery. Sheriff Marla stepped inside, brushing snow from her jacket. "That's it," she said. "We're officially closed off." Griffin nodded. "Power's holding for now," Colin reported from near the counter, radio in hand. His youthful skepticism had been replaced by focused composure. Griffin scanned the room. Children sat near booths. Elderly couples whispered softly. Evan stood by the door, arms crossed, but alert. This wasn't catastrophe. It was containment. "We'll rotate watch shifts," Griffin said calmly. "Keep road clear of additional buildup near town edge. No one drives alone." Marla studied him for a second, assessing leadership not declared, but demonstrated. "You're taking point?" she asked. "I'm assisting," he corrected. But they both understood the weight of that distinction. The night deepened. Wind rattled window panes. There's snow pressed against glass. Griffin stepped outside once more near midnight, Sable beside him. The road beyond town lay buried beneath layered white and dark soil. The ridge above loomed silent, no further movement, just stillness thick as wool. Sable inhaled deeply and exhaled, tension easing slightly. Griffin rested a hand along her back. "You felt that before it moved," he murmured. The dog leaned subtly into his leg. He looked back toward the limestone slope in the distance, faintly visible through snowfall. The trench work held. The ridge had not failed. The only road out was blocked, but the town remained intact. For now, that was enough. Inside, lights flickered once more, then steadied. Griffin turned toward warmth, toward people gathered not in panic, but in patience. The storm was not finished, but neither were they. By dawn, the storm had lost its temper, but not its consequence. Snow lay thick across Kettle Ridge, smoothing sharp edges, disguising the violence of the previous night beneath a deceptively peaceful white. The only road out remained sealed beneath compacted snow and earth. County plows were still hours away. Inside Mrs. Talbot's diner, the air smelled of coffee, wet wool, and human patience. People had slept in booths and along walls wrapped in spare blankets. Children had curled beside parents. No one had panicked. But exhaustion showed in posture in shoulders that sagged, in eyes that blinked slower than usual. Griffin Hale stood near the front windows, arms folded across his chest, listening to the rhythm of the wind easing outside. His olive-gray tactical shirt bore faint streaks of dried snow, but the red thermal beneath it gave off the only warmth he trusted earned, not imagined. His boots were damp, but steady, planted. Sable lay at his feet, chin resting on paws, amber eyes half-lidded yet alert. She had slept in intervals, not deeply. Her coat looked slightly heavier from melted snow dried against fur. The black harness edged in red remained secured. She had not been taken off duty. Sheriff Marla approached him quietly. "Power flickered again around 4, she said. "Backup generator at the clinic's holding." Griffin nodded once. "We move the vulnerable." Marla didn't ask what he meant. Within an hour, a small caravan of townspeople began making their way toward the limestone slope. The decision had not been ceremonial. It had been practical. Griffin's reinforced tunnel was not large enough for everyone, but it was insulated, stable, away from sagging rooftops. June Calder walked beside him up the ridge, braid tucked beneath her hood, and her cheeks were wind-flushed but steady. "You sure about this?" she asked quietly. "It's not ideal," Griffin said. "It's controlled." Behind them came Evan Rourke, carrying 2 heavy bags of supplies across broad shoulders. His copper beard was stiff with frost. He said nothing. Just worked. Colin followed with a portable radio unit and extra batteries, jaw tight, but focused. At the back of the line walked Mrs. Talbot and Margaret Hensley, guiding 2 elderly residents, Frank and Ida Morrison. Frank Morrison was 78, thin as wire, but stubborn as the old timber mill that once stood outside town. His white mustache bristled against his pale skin. Ida, his wife, moved carefully beside him, petite, silver-haired, hands gloved and folded together. She suffered mild asthma and walked slower than the rest. When they reached the limestone entrance, Griffin paused. The trench system held. The rock face above bore no new dark lines. Snow rested but did not sag. He exhaled quietly. Inside, lanterns were already lit. Steel supports glinted in warm light. The air was cool but stable, lacking the bite of open wind. Griffin directed movement carefully. "Elderly and kids inside first. Keep pathways clear. Stay near walls." Sable remained near the entrance, head turning slowly as each person passed. She watched posture, breathing, scent. Frank Morrison paused before entering and looked up at the rock ceiling skeptically. Never thought I'd take shelter in a hole," he muttered. Griffin met his gaze evenly. "It's reinforced." Frank studied him a second longer, then nodded once and stepped inside. The chamber filled gradually, not crowded, but dense with breath and quiet murmurs. June organized seating. Colin positioned the radio near the inner wall. Evan stacked supplies neatly without instruction. Griffin moved between groups, adjusting lantern placement to distribute warmth evenly. Sable shifted inside after the last resident entered, and she stood near the center of the chamber. Still, listening. The cave felt different now. Not empty stone, but occupied shelter. The air held the layered scents of wool, leather, metal, coffee, and human nerves. Griffin leaned briefly against a support beam and closed his eyes for half a second. He felt the weight of responsibility settle not as panic, but as pressure measured in decisions. He remembered another enclosed space long ago, dust thick in air. Radio static cutting through silence, a dog's rigid posture that he had dismissed. Not this time. "Griffin." He opened his eyes. It was Tyler Brooks. The young man stood awkwardly near the entrance, snow still melting from his boots. Without the edge of last night's frustration, he looked younger, uncertain, searching for where to stand. "You need help with anything?" Tyler asked. Griffin studied him briefly. The boy's father's mill had closed when Tyler was 15. The shutdown had hollowed out more than employment. It had hollowed out direction. Grab that water crate, Griffin said. Stack it along the far wall. Tyler nodded quickly and obeyed. The chamber settled into low conversation. Outside, wind shifted again. Sable's ears twitched. She lifted her head sharply. Griffin felt it immediately. Not fear. Alert. He stepped toward the entrance and peered outside. Snow fell lighter now, but wind carved drifts unevenly along the slope. The world looked muffled. Behind him, Ida Morrison coughed short, dry. June moved quickly to her side, kneeling to adjust Ida's scarf. "You all right?" June asked softly. Ida nodded weakly. "Just tight." Griffin measured the air inside. Lantern heat had raised the temperature slightly. Humidity climbed subtly with breath and bodies. He moved to crack the secondary ventilation vent open by an inch. The cave responded with a quiet draft. As Griffin returned toward the center of the chamber, Sable suddenly walked away from the entrance, not toward noise, yes, not toward Ida, but toward the rear wall where older limestone met reinforced steel. She pressed her nose to the rock, held it there, then placed one paw gently against the stone. Not scratching, just touching. Griffin's breath slowed. He stepped beside her. The rock felt cool under his palm. Steady. No vibration. Yet Sable did not withdraw. Her body was rigid, not alarmed, but tuned. For several long seconds, the chamber seemed to quiet further, as if every breath paused in collective instinct. Then Sable stepped back. Sat. Calm. The moment passed, but Griffin knew she had felt something small, something subtle within the stone. Not collapse, adjustment. He did not announce it. There was nothing to alarm, nothing visible. But he marked it. The cave was alive in ways that demanded humility. He scanned the supports again. All secure, no shift. June met his eyes from across the chamber. She had seen Sable's behavior, too. "You felt it?" she whispered later. That's when she joined him near the entrance. "Minor," he replied. June nodded slowly. "Stone contracts as temperature drops. It speaks quietly." Griffin almost smiled. "I prefer quiet." Outside, wind softened. Inside, voices resumed normal rhythm. Margaret Hensley sat near Frank and Ida, knitting with steady hands despite the circumstances. Her movements were small but firm, a woman who believed routine could anchor fear. Evan leaned against the wall, arms folded, gaze drifting occasionally toward the entrance. The usual sarcasm had been replaced by quiet observation. Responsibility had reshaped him slightly. Colin checked the radio again. "County plows delayed another hour," he reported. Marla approached Griffin. "You built this right," she said simply. "I built it to last," he replied. Marla studied the interior once more. "Town owes you." Griffin shook his head. "Town owes itself." Evening approached slowly. The storm thinned to flurries. Children dozed against parents. Lantern light glowed steady, as Ida's breathing eased with warmth. Sable lay now near the entrance again, chin on paws, eyes half closed but not asleep. Griffin sat on the crate he had claimed earlier, hands resting loosely on his knees. He did not feel heroic. He felt necessary. Outside, a faint mechanical rumble eventually echoed through the valley, the distant promise of plows approaching. No one cheered. Relief in small towns rarely arrives loudly. It settles. Like snow. Griffin stood and stepped outside once more. The ridge held. The trench lines were intact. The limestone face remained steady under new accumulation. He looked back into the chamber where people sheltered within walls once questioned. The house in stone had not been foolish. It had been ready. When he re-entered, Sable rose briefly and brushed against his leg before settling again. The storm had tested structure, not destroyed it. And for now, that was enough. The storm left quietly, not in a burst of light, not with a triumphant sunrise, just a gradual thinning of snow until the air felt lighter, as if the sky had finished what it came to say. County plows arrived late morning, engines grinding patiently through the southern roadblock. By noon, the single route out of Kettle Ridge was carved open in narrow, muddy lanes. Power lines were inspected. Roofs were cleared. The town began its slow return to visible normalcy. But storms do not end when roads reopen. They linger in calculations. They linger in absences. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Marla Kincaid stood outside the diner with a clipboard pressed against her coat. The sky had brightened to a pale silver blue, sunlight reflecting sharply off new snow. "Everyone accounted for," Deputy Cullen Reyes reported, radio clipped to his chest. Marla nodded once. "Everyone?" she repeated. The word hovered. Griffin Hale stood a few steps away, hands resting loosely on his hips, eyes scanning faces not for who was present, but for who was not. Sable stood beside him, posture relaxed but attentive. Then June Calder approached quickly from the far side of the street. Her braid had loosened slightly, strands of chestnut hair escaping against wind-reddened cheeks. She looked focused, not alarmed, but searching. "Have you seen Carter?" she asked. Marla frowned faintly. "Carter Whitlow?" June nodded. Carter Whitlow was 17 thin, long-limbed, with sandy blonde hair perpetually falling into eyes too serious for his age. He wore oversized jackets even when unnecessary, as if hiding inside them. His mother had passed 3 years earlier. His father worked 2 towns over and returned only on weekends. Carter spent most afternoons wandering the edges of town with a camera slung around his neck, photographing things no one else noticed. Marla scanned the street again. "He wasn't at the diner?" she asked. "No," June replied quietly. "I assumed he stayed home. But his house is empty." Griffin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Last anyone saw him?" he asked. June hesitated. "Yesterday afternoon, near the old school." The old school building sat near the northern edge of town, a low brick structure long closed after enrollment dropped too low to justify keeping it open. Its basement level had once housed maintenance rooms and storage. Griffin felt something shift beneath the surface of calm. The storm had ended, but the quiet had not. "I'll check," he said simply. Marla did not argue. Sable moved before he did. The walk to the old school took less than 10 minutes. Snow crunched under boots in thick, uneven layers. The building stood partially drifted along its north wall, windows half buried. And the main doors were locked but undamaged. Griffin circled to the side entrance. The basement access door was slightly ajar, not forced, just open enough to invite cold inside. Sable's body stiffened instantly. Her nose lowered toward the threshold. Griffin exhaled once. "Search," he said quietly. Sable entered first, movement fluid and controlled. The basement smelled of damp cement and old insulation. Snow had blown through cracks in the door, leaving a thin white scatter along the floor. Griffin's boots echoed softly on concrete steps. Then Sable stopped. Not at the center of the room, not near visible disturbance. She angled toward a storage alcove at the far end, where old desks and broken chairs were stacked unevenly. Her body lowered slightly, focused, deliberate. Griffin moved slowly behind her. "Carter," he called evenly. "It's Griffin." No answer. Then, a faint sound. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the subtle rhythm of breathing that did not match his own. Sable stepped forward and pressed her nose toward the base of a stack of folding tables. Griffin crouched and pulled one aside carefully. Behind it, wedged between metal frames and cardboard boxes, sat Carter Whitlow. He was pale, but conscious, knees drawn tightly to his chest. His camera lay beside him, strap tangled. His sandy hair fell into wide, frightened eyes. He did not look injured. He looked overwhelmed. "Hey," Griffin said gently. "You're not in trouble." Carter blinked slowly, voice rough. "I didn't want to get in the way." Griffin held his gaze steady. "You weren't in the way." Carter swallowed hard. "Everyone was at the diner. I thought, if something else happened." His words drifted. He had come here before the worst of the storm, likely intending to document it. Then the slide, then isolation. The basement door had blown partially open during wind shifts. He had stayed, perhaps believing he could ride it out unnoticed. Griffin reached out carefully. "You're cold," he said. Carter gave a faint nod. Sable stepped closer and lowered her head into Carter's lap without hesitation. The boy's hands instinctively buried into her thick fur. His breathing steadied. For a brief second, as Griffin helped Carter stand, Sable lifted her head and looked past him toward the far corner of the basement where shadow pooled heavier than it should have. Her body froze. Not in alarm. Recognition. Griffin turned his flashlight toward that dark corner. Nothing moved. Just old pipes and a cracked wall. Yet Sable held her gaze there for a long heartbeat before slowly returning her attention to Carter. Griffin felt the echo of that pause settle into him. He did not voice it. There was no immediate threat. But the dog had sensed something, not human, not recent. Just the lingering presence of emptiness, where something once had been. The building held memory, but not danger. "Let's go," Griffin said quietly, outside. Some sunlight struck the snow so brightly Carter squinted. June was waiting near the schoolyard fence. When she saw Carter, her shoulders dropped visibly in relief. She moved toward him and placed both hands gently on his face. "You scared me," she said softly. "I'm sorry," Carter whispered. "You don't disappear during storms," she replied, not angry, just firm. Marla arrived moments later, boots cutting clean lines in snow. "All accounted for now," she said. Griffin nodded. As they walked back toward town, Carter stayed close to Sable, one hand resting in her fur. The dog moved with steady composure, neither indulgent nor distant. Tyler stood outside the diner when they returned, arms crossed, posture less defensive than before. He gave Carter a short nod respect, earned quietly. Inside, Mrs. Talbot insisted Carter eat immediately. Life resumed in small increments. Later that evening, as the town settled into familiar rhythms, Marla approached Griffin near the slope leading back toward the limestone ridge. "You've got a knack," she said. "For what?" "For being where you're needed." Griffin shook his head slightly. "I just listen," he said. Marla studied him for a moment longer, then extended a hand. "We're forming a formal emergency response group," she said. "Volunteer-led. I want you on it." Griffin looked toward the ridge above, then down at Sable sitting quietly beside him. The dog's amber eyes met his. Not expectation. Just steadiness. "I'll help," he said. That night, back at the limestone chamber, Griffin stood alone at the entrance. The trench lines were intact, the supports steady, the ridge quiet beneath moonlight. Sable sat at his side, watching the forest. No wind, no movement, no unsettled breath beneath stone. Griffin exhaled slowly. The mountain had tested them. The town had held. He rested his hand against the cool limestone wall. It did not shift. It did not warn. It simply existed. And Sable, ever alert, yet watched the dark timberline one last time before lowering herself to rest. The storm had passed. The town remained, and Griffin no longer stood at its edge. He stood within it. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as fire in the sky or voices in the wind. Sometimes they come quietly, in the steady hand of a neighbor, in the strength to prepare before the storm, in the instinct of a dog who listens when we do not. Maybe that is how God often works. Not by removing every storm, but by placing the right people beside us when it comes. Not by silencing the mountain, but by teaching us to hear its warnings. Not by making us fearless, but by reminding us that we are never alone. In everyday life, the storms are not always made of snow and stone. They look like uncertainty, loss, exhaustion, doubt. They close roads. They shake foundations. They test what we thought was solid. But faith is not the absence of shaking. Faith is choosing to build wisely anyway, to prepare, to listen, to trust that even when the ground shifts, God has not stepped away. Maybe the real miracle in this story was not survival. It was alignment. A man who learned to listen. A town that chose to stand together. A dog that never stopped paying attention. And a quiet reminder that grace often speaks in whispers. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may be walking through their own storm. Leave a comment and tell us where you have seen quiet strength in your life. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that remind us to listen more closely. To the earth, to each other, and to God. May the Lord bless you and your family. May He steady your ground when it feels uncertain. May He guide your steps, calm your fears, and surround you with people who stand beside you when the wind rises. And may you never miss the quiet miracles happening right in front of you.